Class is in session. Welcome back to the Fantasy Hockey Podcast and the first episode of Fantasy Hockey 101. In this series, we're going to be trying to teach you guys about some of the nuances of fantasy hockey and how you can use some of these concepts to make you a stronger player in your season and win those championships. This first ever edition is going to be about stacks. Stacking players, stacking lines, all on the same team. Whether it's a good idea to target a Stamkos when you have Kucherov or a Marner when you have John Tavares. We get these questions all the time, and it's something that I thought we'd need to cover for a long time now. Before we actually go looking at the data, let's first talk about some of the ideas of what we're talking about here. I'm going to preface this by saying intentionally stacking players is typically not a good idea. And there's a few reasons for that. The first one is scheduling. Players that, if you have, let's say, 3 players from the Tampa Bay Lightning, it's a good example so far. They've played a lot of 2-game slates, and in those slates, you know that you're not going to get the starts out of those players. And the more players you have on that team, the more you're locked into their schedule, which can give you a lot of up and down. If they play 4 games in a week, it can be good news. If they play 2 games, it's definitely bad news. Now, I say it can be good news for 4 games because just because they play 4 games doesn't mean there's not going to be consequences from stacking on the same team. Let's say that they play let's say they play Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. These are typically heavy game slates. If this is a busy week, you're going to wind up benching players. So as far as if you are, or for some reason you have a stack, which happens, right? You'll wind up with 2 players on the team, possibly even 3. If they're all forwards, that's where it gets kind of dicey. But if it's I don't really consider goaltenders for this either, but if it's 2 forwards in a defense, might be okay. But when you have that many players from a given team, you're going to wind up with bench issues. So especially if you have 3 forwards, let's say you have 2 centers and a wing or something, or let's say you have a whole line, 2 wingers and a center. You know that you've eaten up 3 spots from a starting roster on already heavy game nights for a given week. So now you're going to have to, maybe these players are all good enough that they're going to play, but you have to worry about your other players that you have to bench. You're going to have to bench somebody. So there is a little bit of room given to teams that play a lot of off nights, and we'll cover those teams. And you need to look at this to start the season because off nights are important regardless in daily setup leagues. In weekly lock leagues, it doesn't really matter. But in daily leagues, which most of us play, where you set your lineup every day, off nights absolutely do matter, and they do change the value of given players. The only team that typically every single season has good off nights is Anaheim for whatever reason. Must have something to do with what's going on in their stadium, but they always seem to have good off nights, and this season is no different. So if you for some reason still want to stack, then I guess target off night teams because they're a little bit better. Okay, so let's jump right into the data here. The first thing to look at here are going to be the off nights that I already mentioned. So this is the most minor piece as far as how stacking goes, but this is the rest of season schedule we've got going on here. You can't see it on the podcast, but basically the Ducks, the Rangers, and the Capitals are the 3 teams with the most off nights for the rest of the season. Now, at this point, I don't think you'd be targeting stacks anyway, so let's go ahead and look at the season-long outlook. With this view, the Ducks, the Caps, and the Oilers, and then the Rangers, were the teams with the most off nights for the entire season. So there's a little bit of a bonus given to these teams. By the way, these first 2 tools we're going to look at were built by Zero Gar over on the Fantasy Hockey Podcast Discord, which you can find links to in the description of this video, as well as on our website, fantasyhockeypodcast.com, and basically anywhere you can find us. So that's the little bit there. And then let's look at the actual schedule for, let's go ahead and look at this week. This week is the 5th week for most leagues. Tampa is once again playing 2 games. This is next week, actually. So this week they played, again, 2 games. They've been playing a lot of 2-game slates, this being Tampa. So you're already feeling it if you stack Tampa. If you had something like Kuch, Stamkos, and Point, if you got all 3 of them, you're feeling it because of schedule. And even when they are playing, when they play these 2-game slates, they're already see these grayed out are the heavy game nights. So they're not even playing off-night schedules. So not only are you only getting 2 starts of them, you're also benching. So you're just losing starts all over the place. So this is just a minor little piece about the kind of a different nuance of stacking. Okay, so this sheet is what we're going to use for the most of what I'm talking about here. This sheet that I'm showing on the YouTube video is a sheet that's going to tell us the standard deviation of these pairs. And what that means is for the amount of players that I put in here, it's going to show us how much above or below the average that they would put out they did on a given week. So this means if they put out 1 point between all, and this is only points, so 1 point between, let's say, all three players that I label here. If they only put out 1 point in 1 week and they put out 20 points in the next week, then they're going to have a very high standard deviation. So you want that to be low because you want to be consistently above average. That's the goal here. A higher standard deviation means that you're going to be going up and down a lot. And you don't want to be going up and down a lot because if you have a down week against a bad team, you can lose a week against a much weaker team than your actual your squad. And if you lose to a weaker team and then you beat a team that you should have beaten when you have a good week, you're not really getting the most out of your team. What you want to have is you want to be just beating everybody. You don't need to be crushing everybody. There's no point to that unless you can consistently. The basis is consistently above average as opposed to a good team that's going up and down like crazy. And that's what I'm going to try to prove here. So let's start with Mark Scheifele. Now, Mark Scheifele is his standard deviation for himself was 3. So that means at a given week, he could have gone above or below his average point totals by up to 3 points, which is a lot. It's unusual for a center to be that high, an elite center like him. And for the purposes of this, we're going to be targeting only players that played all 82 games so that we don't have people getting zeros for their a weekly point total due to injury. And we're also going to be ignoring the weird weeks. So week 1, this is Yahoo weeks of last season, was extended. The All-Star break's extended. Christmas is just a weird week where there's not a lot of games played. And the last week of the season is extended. So I'm just ruling all of those out. So the total point values that you see out for these players are going to be a little bit lower than their actual total points. So Mark Scheifele, 74 total points over that span, a 2.96 standard deviation. And then his line mate, Blake Wheeler, over the same time frame, 80 total points, a 2.22 standard deviation. So this means he's basically plus or minus 2. So that's a lot more consistent. You still see like a very consistent player, and actually the worst players are more consistent because they're just getting 0s and 1s all the time. But for elite players, to be below a 2 is really good. To be able to put up point per game pace or above and be below plus or minus 2 points on any given week is really strong, really consistent. We see that in Tampa. We'll show that later. For those of you looking at the YouTube video, I'm going to break down the weeks so you can see these are color-coded, but week 1 is grayed out because we are not counting week 1, as we said. So week 2 starts. Between the two of them, they wound up with 4 points. You can see from this red scale, they both got 2, by the way. So week 2 was the 15th of October to the 21st of October back in 2018, and they both got 2 points. For a total of 4. Now, 4 is color-coded red here because it was one of their worst weeks of the season. And then the next one, week 3, the 22nd to the 28th, they had a total of 12 points. You can, even just by glancing through this, you see week 6, they had 2 points. You can kind of assume where they ran into weeks where their schedule was not good. Or they were just weak. But typically, if I see where I see red, that's where I'm assuming I know they either had a bad week or they had a bad schedule. And that's understandable. So we see here for the combination, we wind up with 154 points on the season between Mark Scheifele and Blake Wheeler and a standard deviation of 4.87, which means that on a given week, if you had both these players, them combined is going to give you above or below their average of 5 points, which is a pretty high number. So what happens if we break this pair up? What happens if we swap Scheifele and somebody who's pretty similar as far as point production and standard deviation, which is important because if I just put in a guy here that has very low standard deviation, it's obviously going to lower the overall deviation. I'm hoping this isn't too complicated, but it's going to lower the overall deviation for both players just because the individual was more consistent. So I'm looking for a player that was as inconsistent as Mark Scheifele with a similar point total. And somebody that I found that was close to that is Johnny Gaudreau. Now, in the same time frame, Johnny Gaudreau got 80 points as opposed to Scheifele's 74. So there's a little bit more there, but it doesn't really matter. But his standard deviation was right around the same at 2.94. So if we look back, we had Scheifele 2.96, and now we've got Gaudreau at 2.93. So their deviations are very similar. But what we see here is that the deviation for both of them went from like almost 5 all the way down to below 4. So now their deviation for the pair is at 3.78, which is way, way, way better. That means I'm going to repeat this over and over because it's kind of a complicated concept, but from a week to week basis, as opposed to going up and down 5 points, you could have either had an 8-point or a 14-point week 1 week, all the way down to a 4-point week the next week because of how high the standard deviation was before. Now it's down to 4. So that's still, it's still high and it always will be high, but that's much more consistent. You know, you're not going to have this like great week, blowout week, and back and forth. So now let's swap in Scheifele just to show that this isn't just Scheifele for Gaudreau, and look at swapping Blake Wheeler out, a much more consistent player at his 2.22 standard deviation for his individual, for Patrick Kane, who actually was pretty close, believe it or not. Patrick Kane had 82 points in this time frame, a 2.17 standard deviation, and it drops all the way down to 3.5 points for the pair. So again, Mark Scheifele and Blake Wheeler, their standard deviation was, what was it, almost 6? Oh no, it was 4.86. So that's nearly 5. And now we swap Wheeler back out with Kane, and we see that their standard deviation's all the way down to 3.5. So we've reduced that like sort of I don't want to call it it is variance, but that like inconsistency in point production from up or down 5 points per week to up or down 3.5 points per week. And that's obviously unavoidable. No matter how good your team is, you'll have good and bad weeks. So there will be some sort of standard deviation here, but you want to keep that lower so you can be consistently good. Now, let's swap to, I already hinted that Marner and Tavares were actually pretty, actually I hinted about the Lightning, but Marner and Tavares were actually very consistent as well. And we're going to go ahead and add in Morgan Riley here. So a 3-person stack. This seems to be a pretty typical stack that people may have targeted this season, may have had last season. Mitch Marner, 72 points over the time frame we're talking about, a 1.88 standard deviation. So these players were just much more consistent than the Jets in general. That could have something to do with schedule, could have something to do with them just playing well on their bad games, on their bad nights, rather. John Tavares, 69 points over the course that we're looking for, a 1.67 standard deviation. So that means his is pretty low as well, almost a 1.5, which is way better than Scheifele's 3. But again, this is not something you can really predict whether they're going to play well on their bad schedules and all that good stuff. So for the purposes of the individual, we're only looking at this to find a common replacement. We're looking at their standard deviation to see, from an individual perspective, to see somebody that we could replace them with, and then look at the total standard deviation for all 3. Morgan Riley, 51 points in that time, a 1.9 standard deviation. So all these guys were pretty consistent, and the total points here are 192. Standard deviation is a 4.6, which is actually lower than just the pair of Scheifele and Wheeler, which is surprising because as you add more players from a team, the variance is typically going to go higher. But Scheifele and Wheeler were so inconsistent for whatever reason that theirs was just higher anyway. So let's go ahead and we'll swap in a few examples for Riley because there were a few that were close by. The first one, we'll swap in Roman Josi. Roman Josi had 50 points and a 1.79 standard deviation. So he's right in the same wheelhouse, a little bit more consistent than Riley. We see the standard deviation for all 3 drop to 3.7 or 3.97. So it goes down a little bit. It's not a ton, but it does go down. And then if we can use Yandel in here as well. Yandel was way more consistent in general, and we see the standard deviation number drop even more. So these were like replacements that you could have had for Riley that all will bring down your deviation. It'll make you more consistent for not having the stack. I'm going to go ahead and swap back to Riley for the purposes of this. This will get a little bit too detailed. So again, 4.57 is the standard deviation for this triplet. Let's go ahead and swap Tavares for Giroux, who is pretty close. So Tavares was 69 points, a 1.66 or 1.67 standard deviation. Giroux, 68 points, a 1.9 deviation, but he still drops the deviation for the triplet. And that shouldn't happen except for the fact he's on a different team. So this means that when you have all these players who were super consistent, Marner, Tavares, and Riley were super consistent last season, but because of scheduling and just because of the ebbs and flows of the seasons and the strength of schedule and whatever else, they're going to have better games and worse games at similar times, or worse weeks rather, at similar times. So you swap Giroux in, and despite the fact that he as an individual is more inconsistent than, or less consistent, I guess is the easier way to say that, than Tavares, he still brings down the deviation for all three of them down to 3.76. And that's just because his schedule is different. He was strong at different times. His schedule, both from a games played point of view and a strength of schedule point of view, is different. So we see this number go down. Now, if we go ahead and swap Marner out as well for Ovechkin, is actually pretty close to him in point production. So 72 points, a 1.88 for Marner. We swap in Ovechkin. We have 71 points and a 1.67. So now we've totally broken everything up, right? We don't have anybody from the same team anymore. We have Ovechkin, Giroux, and Riley. The point total for all three of these is 190. The deviations for the individuals are almost the same. And we have a 2.8 deviation for all three, which means now we're looking at three players that score a ton of points, and they're only deviating from their average by 2.8 points per game, per week, rather. So that means that you're much more consistent than what we saw originally. So to go back to what we had to begin with, we put Marner and Tavares back. From the individual point of view, these guys were super consistent, but you're looking at a 4.57 plus or minus that many points on a given week. That's how much you can expect them to deviate as a group from their norm. And then again, if we go back to the Ovechkin, Giroux, Riley triplet, 2.8. So way more consistent. That means you're getting the same point production just about. You're getting 190 points compared to the 192. So same point production, but at a much more consistent rate throughout the season. Now, I'll swap into one more line here before we wrap this up, and that'll be all three forwards. So we're looking at two forwards. We've looked at two forwards as a pair. We've looked at two forwards and defensemen, and now we're going to look at three forwards. So I'm going to go to Florida. Florida was actually the easiest one to use, as they were pretty consistent in their lineup with Huberdeau, Barkov, and Dadonov all on the top line. They all played 82 games. And that's basically what we're looking for. So we have Huberdeau here, 76 points, a 2.44 deviation. Barkov here, 77 points, a 2.03 deviation. And Dadonov, 54 points, a 1.49 deviation. Now, Dadonov, you might be thinking, why is Dadonov so consistent? He's more consistent than Huberdeau and Barkov. That doesn't make sense. He's more consistent because he scored less points. Barkov and Huberdeau, they would score in bunches. Well, not only in bunches, but they would also just score pretty consistently. So instead of being 0 points, 1 points, 2 points, like we got from Dadonov, you'd have not very many zeros, but a lot of ones, twos, threes, even from these other guys. So they're seeing anywhere between 0 and 3, maybe even 4 points per game because of how good they were. And then Dadonov was usually between 0 and 1. We can look this by looking at the weeks. We can see that, per game, so per week, a little higher than that, but you can see Dadonov's pretty consistent here. He's usually getting somewhere between 2 and 4 points over a given week. And then above him on Huberdeau and Barkov were anywhere between, Huberdeau has a 9 point in there. They would get hotter is basically what's happening. So they would deviate a little bit more, which makes sense for a player that's going to get more points. If you're going to get no points the entire season, you're the most consistent player on the planet because your deviation will be 0 because you got nothing. So that's how that all works. Anyway, for all three, this is a triplet of the same line on the same team, which seems to be what people like to target the most. 207 total points, a 5.33 standard deviation. Now, let's make some swaps. What happens if we swap Dadonov for Ryan Nugent-Hopkins? So again, Dadonov, 54 points, a 1.49 standard deviation, and we're looking at 5.33 for the entire line. Now, I'm sorry, it's so number heavy, but it kind of has to be. So we're going to swap him for Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. He had 56 points in the same time frame, a 1.51 standard deviation. So that's almost exactly the same as we saw from Dadonov. But the standard deviation for the group drops all the way down to 3.90. So that's going from 5.33 for the entire group, a plus or minus 5.33 for a given week, all the way down to 3.89, and that already looks way, way better. You're reducing that crazy variance from a given week, and you have essentially the same player. And that's the key here. You want to be replacing these stacked players with as close as you can get to the same player on different teams. Let's go ahead and swap Stamkos back in for Barkov here. Oh, no, we haven't even talked about Stamkos. So Stamkos in for Barkov. Barkov, 77 points. Stamkos, 82. Their deviations are extremely similar. We've got 2.03 for Barkov. We have 1.88 for Stamkos. The deviation for all three, now they're all split up all the way down to 2.47. So that's super consistent. That's really, really consistent. They didn't play they were strong at different times so that instead of having weeks where you have 1 point and weeks where you have 12 points, you wind up with weeks where you have somewhere between 4 and 8, which is, if you have a strong team, that's what you want. We can swap Nugent Hopkins back in for Dadonov, just for the sake of comparison. We have 3.32 standard deviation, so it still looks really good even with the pair. But that's because we have Stamkos replacing Barkov to kind of even things out. Lastly, we'll replace Huberdeau with Gaudreau, who we've already talked about. If I can spell it right. So 77 points, or 76 points, 2.44 deviation individual for Huberdeau. Gaudreau, we've got 80 points, a 2.94 standard deviation. So pretty similar. Gaudreau is actually much higher from the deviation standpoint, and yet he still is able to bring down the overall standard deviation, even paired with Dadonov still. So despite the fact that Gaudreau was much more inconsistent than Huberdeau, he's still able to bring down the consistency in points to a more consistent level by replacing Huberdeau with him. So to recap everything, I'm gonna try to make this as concise as possible because I know I threw a lot of numbers at you. The basic concept we're going for here is targeting stacks intentionally is going to increase the amount of times you're going to have bad games or bad weeks, and the amount of times you're going to have good weeks, which you don't want. You want to have consistently above average weeks so that you beat every team you should be beating, as opposed to beating bad teams, or rather losing to bad teams and maybe also crushing bad teams. You want to be able to beat the teams you should beat. That's the big thing. You don't want to be losing to teams you should be beating because you had a bad schedule or your guys had a bad week or whatever. So the one thing I feel like is lost a lot of times is you think, okay, if I have JT and I get Marner, then they'll assist each other. They'll get a JT goal means a Marner assist. What that doesn't mean is if Marner's going to get a point per game, he's not going to get any more than a point per game if you add him to your team just because you have Tavares. And that means you are also not going to get more than a point per game just because you have Tavares. You're going to wind up with, again, these weeks where you're going to get a lot of points because they did assist each other, and then the weeks where you don't get any points or very low points because they both have bad games. So that is the takeaway here. I'm not saying if you do have a triplet, you should be looking to try to trade one of them. I've actually got one in my league. It's not a huge rush, but when you see that 2-game week coming or a bad schedule, you know you're going to get hurt on that week. So you should be trying to move out one of your guys if you have a triplet. If you have a pair, it's fine, but the higher end that pair is, the stronger the players are in that pair, means that variance is going to hit you more when you have a bad week. These Tampa weeks, right? The Stamkos Kuch thing, you're probably getting crushed if you have that pair, especially with the triplet point, because they've played so many 2-game slates. So you're probably starting off weak. And Kucherov hasn't been as strong as he has been in previous years. So bundle all this stuff together. The basic concept here is stacks for pairs are fine, kind of. Stacks, any more than that, you're getting into dangerous territory, and you should never, ever intentionally target a stack. It's just not good. It's only good for where you want high variance, something like daily fantasy, where you want to make sure that if you lose, if you get no points, it doesn't really matter. If you get tons of points, that's how you win. So daily fantasy stacks are great. Any other type, they're just bad news. In Roto, it doesn't matter at all. So go ahead, I guess. But in standard weekly head-to-heads where I see a lot of the stack stuff coming, bad news. So with that, I'm going to assign some homework. look through your teams, try to find your stacks, which shouldn't be too hard, and figure out what you need to do about them. If you've got 3 or more, God forbid, be looking to look for equivalent players, even if it feels like it's a push for the trade. You're not winning the trade. It doesn't really matter. You're winning the trade because you're breaking up your stack. That'll be the homework for everybody. And with that, class is dismissed.